One of the first things that critics, scholars, and fans say about Sofia Coppola is that she is a woman. Many have deemed her the feminine auteur of Hollywood. Some critics, like Michael Booth of the Denver Post, problematize the feminine aspects of her filmmaking. In his review of Coppola's most controversial film, perhaps because it recounts the story of a young woman making a world for herself, something we don't see very often in media, Booth says, "If you could predict the shallowness of the movie that might be made by a director who collaborated with the New York Times Style magazine on a shopper's guide to Paris, Marie Antoinette is that film." As if Coppola's interest in fashion, an industry seen as feminine, inherently implicates the depth of her films. Other critics and scholars laud Coppola's films for what they deem her feminine gaze, or the cinema of girlhood. According to Todd Kennedy, the camera asks the spectator to gaze with, not at, female protagonists. This trend appears in Coppola's Oscar-winning film Lost in Translation, where we see Charlotte, played by Scarlett Johansson. But then we cut to and hold on what Charlotte sees. This allegedly feminine gaze returns in Marie Antoinette, Somewhere, and The Bling Ring. Coppola lets us see the world through the eyes of her characters, who often happen to be female and feminine. This is not incidental. An important aspect of Coppola's filmmaking is that she feels everyone should tell what they know in the world that they know. This feminine gaze allows us to take pleasure in and feel ambivalent toward the objects Coppola's female characters take pleasure in and feel ambivalent toward, humanizing her characters and giving them agency. Todd Kennedy argues that Coppola takes this feminine gaze even farther than most critics recognize, not just reversing the male gaze, but inverting it. Point-of-view shots from the perspectives of Coppola's female characters don't merely force the audience to gaze with the women, but also force the audience to be gazed upon. In this scene, where Marie Antoinette enters Versailles, Coppola shows us Antoinette's point of view. We see the stern faces and elaborate costumes of Parisians Antoinette has not yet come to know. We feel alienated by the judgment of the crowd. This happens again at Antoinette's wedding, and again the first time she is introduced to the customs of the palace. A scene in which we see her back and her viewpoint, while she stands naked and cold before a crowd of strangers, waiting for the person deemed properly suited to dress her. We also see this technique in The Bling Ring. Kennedy says this inversion of the male gaze forces the viewer to empathize with women and teenage girls, to feel with women and teenage girls what it is like to be scrutinized and objectified. But I argue that she does even more. I think it's interesting to look at Somewhere and The Virgin Suicides, two Coppola films that do follow male perspectives, to see how she demystifies and problematizes the objectification of women and girls. Somewhere follows Johnny Marco, played by Stephen Dorff. Johnny Marco is a movie star who constantly sleeps with women, yet is largely ambivalent about his life. This film does follow a male gaze, the gaze of Marco, and Marco does objectify women for pleasure. Coppola's representation of this objectification, however, is unique in that it is demystifying. In this scene, for example, Marco watches two women pole dance in his hotel room. As we watch the women, through Marco's point of view, the camera angle is a little askew and the lighting is dim. Coppola rejects any inherent flashiness we would expect from seeing sexualized women. The most notable technique she uses in this rejection of the hypersexual as inherently flashy is her extremely long take. This take, and other takes in this scene, last as long as 30 seconds before we cut back to Marco for a few moments and then return to the dancers. The stillness of the camera emphasizes the length of the take, because we are stuck watching the same framing long enough to make us feel awkward or bored. Coppola does not edit together a montage of isolated body parts, flashing lights, and Marco's smiling face. She presents the pole dancers as they appear from Marco's perspective, and she presents Marco as he feels, tired. At the end of the scene, he literally falls asleep, letting us know that for him, the act of hypersexualizing women, though appealing enough for him to purchase a private pole dancing show, is unfulfilling enough to put him to sleep. We see Marco's unfulfillment with hypersexualized women repeated in this scene, where Marco falls asleep going down on a woman he just met at a party.
Johnny.
Long takes become a motif throughout this film, often emphasizing Marco's isolation in spite of his privileged masculine lifestyle. The opening shot features Marco racing circles in his Ferrari for a full minute and 30 seconds, literally going nowhere fast. The camera is locked down and we can't even see the entire track. Our perspective is narrow and stuck this way, much like Marco's. This scene sets up the rest of the film for its continually slow pace, what one critic calls Coppola's sublime stillness, a minimalistic technique that emphasizes image and mood. This stillness and lingering creates enough space within each scene for us to feel a little bored and a little lost in Marco's ennui. Perhaps the most literal representation of Marco's boredom and isolation happens here. Marco's face is being made into a plaster cast, and we slowly pan in on him, absolutely isolated and masked in the plaster that is hardening around him, in a shot that lasts a whole minute and 42 seconds. This is the reality of fame and hypermasculinity, according to Coppola. A lonely, binding, and hardening mask. Marco's lack of fulfillment in his celebrity, hypermasculine lifestyle is made most evident through the contrast of Marco's objectifying gaze, a way of seeing the world that clearly does not fulfill him, and his gaze when he looks at his daughter, Cleo, played by Elle Fanning. In one of the first scenes with Cleo, we watch Marco watch Cleo ice skate. Marco's expression in this scene changes to become markedly different from the previous scenes in which he watched his private pole dancers. Here, he is engaged. The length of this take becomes uncomfortable because the pacing is similar to the pace through which we recently watched the pole dancers, and the performative nature of Cleo's skating and costuming resembles the performative nature and sexualized outfits of the pole dancers. It is clear to us, from Marco's reaction, that he does not see Cleo the way he sees the women he objectifies. But this disconnect between the way he views his daughter and the way he views other women is unsettling for us. We are set up to see women through Marco's sexualized gaze, so having Cleo placed into this gaze unnerves us. It is noteworthy that in this scene, the camera is fluid. Marco is not stuck in one perspective when he watches Cleo. When Marco spends time with Cleo, he is not locked down in his objectifying, hypersexualizing perspective. He sees her as a whole person who enables him to find meaning in his life, and this meaning impels him to be a better father and a better man, even if he struggles in doing so. Coppola follows Marco's literal male gaze rather than the flashy, cinematic version of the male gaze we're used to seeing. Removed from its glamour, it appears grotesque, isolating, and unsatisfying. In The Virgin Suicides, on the other hand, Coppola engages deeply with the male gaze in the manner we are used to seeing it. The Virgin Suicides is a story about a family of teenage girls, but a story narrated and represented by a teenage boy who fetishized and fantasized about these girls. We see the narrator's images of the Lisbon girls through sequences that actively reduce them to fit his fantasy. As the lust-struck teenage boys read Cecilia's diary, this is what they imagine. The world of girlhood, for them, is so removed from their world and so distinctive that they can't separate the image of the girls from images of literal unicorns and rainbows. Coppola shrouds the girls in golden light in this scene, emphasizing how idealized they are in the eyes of the boys. She employs fades and superimposes the images over each other in a blurring, dreamlike way. The girls cannot be separated from fireworks, blue skies, meadows, and swings. They only exist in the boys' minds insofar as they are imagined. The absurdity of Lux, played by Kirsten Dunst, dancing in a bikini with a flower crown in a meadow, is lost on us, because in this film, most of what we see and hear is girl as spectacle, girl as fantasy. This does not surprise us because we already expect to see women represented as fantasized objects in media. What does surprise us in The Virgin Suicides is suicide. All 5 Lisbon girls kill themselves, shattering their existences as living human beings. By the end of the film, they can only exist in fantasy. What Coppola says through these suicides is that when girls and women only exist in the realm of male fantasy, they cannot go on existing. Coppola absolutely disrupts the magic of the male gaze with the bloody image of Cecilia impaled by her fence, Bonnie swinging from a noose, Mary unconscious on the floor, Teresa's death by sleeping pills, and Lux's death by suffocation. The teenage boys in this film have so ardently idealized the Lisbon girls that they continue to fantasize about the girls even after they're dead. But for us, the viewers, the diegesis of the fantasy has been broken. Coppola's depictions of the dead girls, in contrast to what we've seen of their lived experiences in this film, compel us to prioritize the lives of the girls over the romanticized perspective through which we've been watching them. In Somewhere and the Virgin Suicides, Coppola does not evade the male gaze. She treats her male characters with the same integrity and honesty with which she treats her female characters, but she removes the male gaze from its pleasing pedestal in popular cinema. Instead, she utilizes the male gaze as a tool through which to problematize itself.